It's Sunday, June 18, 2023. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. You can support my work on Patreon at patreon.com/5minutenews. Joining us today is technologist, columnist for the Washington Spectator, and investigative journalist addressing threats to democracy. Dave Troy, welcome back to the Weekend Show.
Glad to be here, Anthony. Thank you.
So a lot happening. Reaction to Donald Trump's indictment has kind of reverberated around America and the wider world. And it's that reverberation that I'm interested in talking about today. He's become the first former president to face federal charges. His supporters went through a familiar routine of mounting a victimhood defense in the face of these allegations. But the thing I'm really most interested in looking at today is how he continues to claim that these allegations are not just a witch hunt and a hoax, but also that the DOJ is weaponized, that all the things that he basically did with his Department of Justice while he was president, he's claiming that Joe Biden does with Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, and Jack Smith, who he says is a Trump hater, and so's his wife and friends and family. I mean, it's like it's comical almost, but it shouldn't be, because, in the process of all of this hate speech coming out of Trump's face, democracy is being undermined in America.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think what he's really doing is giving talking points to his supporters. And it makes it possible for them to live in this bifurcated universe where there's two sets of facts. There's reality, and then there's the stuff that the Trump supporters are saying. And it's a really interesting process. One of my rituals is I listen each morning to C-SPAN. I listen to their Washington Journal program, which is usually they have a guest, and then they have people calling in from around the country, and they express their views on all the issues and whatnot. And what's interesting is comparing that messaging that you hear, on the C-SPAN audience with, kind of like what you see on social media, and you start to get a sense of how the information flows and like how the messaging works in terms of, getting these talking points out into people's mouths. And, it's remarkable. I mean, people will call up and say that, that the Presidential Records Act, and they say this stuff with incredible certainty that, that the president can declassify anything he chooses to, and that the Presidential Records Act is, gives him authority to have had these documents. And, these people are not legal experts. These are just people that have picked up stuff from the ecosystem and are repeating it back in a way that gives them a lot of victimhood, as well as a lot of confidence that, they are victims, and that their whole in-group is being targeted, by this evil outgroup. And so, this in-group, out-group dynamics is really where I spend a lot of my time studying this situation. And I think a lot of the purpose of Trump's rhetoric is to really fuel that in-group, out-group divide, and to create, a real adhesion within the in-group, while at the same time demonizing the out-group. And none of that has anything to do with truth or what really is going on or the law or anything else. It's all about how instrumentally can you get these networks riled up at each other. And he does a great job of it.
He's pivoting to a phrase that was weaponized against him previously, and that is election interference, and claiming that this whole investigation is trying to interfere with the 2024 election to prevent him from being the president. He's claiming that Biden is behaving like a dictator, again, ironic, right, considering that Trump has the history of the dictatorship, and is trying to kind of lock up his political opponent, and he's claiming that this stuff only happens in Russia or other places, and is now kind of bringing it home. And it's very, to the people who are in the cult of Trump, that seems very valid, doesn't it? It's very easy for them to go, yeah, well, of course, that's what Biden's doing.
Yeah.
Let's just kind of unpick that use of language.
Well, when you talk about election interference, there's at the heart of some of this is something that I've kind of taken to call the purity myth, that there is this virginal American democracy that's, untouched and pure and white as snow and all of this. And then there's these evildoers that are contaminating, the democracy or the election. And, so the interference, comes in. And of course, that completely ignores, all the stuff that Russia was doing to manipulate the information space, previously. But, it's this idea that, there's this pure thing that's been adulterated, and the adulterators are the outgroup that you want to try to kill, basically. Because this isn't about beating people, politically at some point. It's more of an existential battle between the wills of these two networks. And, you see that pattern repeat itself throughout history. The Salem witch trials were essentially the same construct. There's a great book called Salem Possessed by two historians, Boyer and Nissenbaum, that talks about how that was really a conflict between agricultural and mercantile networks that thought that each of them were cross-contaminating each other and they were evil. And so, they built this whole elaborate witch narrative to justify burning people at the stake and whatnot, but ultimately it was two conflicting networks. And I think the same kind of thing is going on here. And that's why, when Trump uses phrases like, it's a witch hunt, I mean, he's actually making a pretty reasonable, historical comparison. It's just in his case, he's on the witch end of the stick. But, there's a reason why, he's being, indicted. It's because of all the law breaking, it tends to result in a fair amount of indictment. So, interesting stuff. And you can actually look at the vaccine stuff through a similar lens where, you've got your body and it's being contaminated, they say, by these external factors that are changing your DNA in order to produce, immune agents and whatnot. And so it's a really powerful narrative device and one that just comes up again and again. And so, yeah, I think he's really amplifying that dynamic of this social in-group, out-group tension.
But with that example of the pandemic, it requires you leaving the pandemic out of the equation, right? You're just focusing on the vaccine, right. And that's kind of, that's the bit that they're looking at.
Well, there's
it's
also
the same with this, though, isn't it?
There's the whole, lab
leaving
narrative.
The crimes out of the equation.
There's the whole lab leak narrative that posits a similar kind of thing that, the Chinese generated this virus, with Anthony Fauci's help. That's what the myth is. And, we'll find out someday where that all came from. But, that's the myth, is that these evildoers contaminated the world's bodies with this evil virus. And then there's a second round of even worse evil as the vaccines. And so it's, again, this contamination narrative that's just everywhere.
And when you put words out into the public domain that if anyone wants to talk about it with their friends or do a little Google search, they'll get the answers that they're looking for, right?
Yeah.
That kind of desire to seek out the answer that you are hoping for, and you will find it. You just don't read the detail. And without the detail, it all makes sense.
Right. Yeah. And I think part of what, the genius of kind of Trump's approach to how he uses information is that he puts out multiple almost competing narratives sometimes that don't internally really make any sense if you compare them to each other. And but what will end up happening is that the information ecosystem will essentially nominate winners of those narratives, and the ones that are sort of the most dominant. It's like viruses, they'll sort of gain momentum and traction out in the ecosphere. And, those ones are the ones that wins. And then the ones that were too stupid or didn't resonate enough, they fall away and everybody forgets about them. And that was, something that people started to notice in the 2016 cycle was that, he would say just a whole litany of crazy things and they would often conflict, but different audiences heard those different things and each message resonated differently with slightly different audiences. So he's literally able to sort of in parallel broadcast to multiple audiences at the same time, while also injecting enough information, out in the ecosystem to sort of nominate winners that people can then go and repurpose for, Daily Caller or Gateway Pundit or Fox or whatever, So it's a really powerful technique. It's fascinating to watch. It's terrifying, but it's fascinating.
But he also relies on his base or his voters or even, regular people, not even undecided, because there's problem with America is it's a two-party system, right? So, that you're either in that camp, but it's quite a long stretch to come back into that camp. He relies on people being uneducated. He relies on people not having a great instinct. He relies on people not doing the research and just relying on Facebook or friends. And no one in the US really is prepared to talk about that kind of lack of education or intellect, or he's relying on that. And the reality is that people are very easily swayed. Even the educated people obviously have vulnerabilities, and we know that through cults. But in this case, he is relying on people who he feels like he has nothing in common with, buying into his brand, not doing the research, and just taking anything that he says as gospel.
Well, I want to maybe add some color to that, which is that I think, and research tends to support this, that there's maybe 70% of the country that's kind of in the middle and is really just tired of all of this. The other 30% is nuts, and that includes, a big chunk on the far right, and there's some on the far left that are off the deep end. And, but that 70% that just wants stability, that just wants decency, that just wants common sense answers, and they want to raise their families, they want to have a 401k that doesn't go to shit every once in a while. Like, they just want a life that makes sense. I think that was expressed really profoundly in the debt ceiling vote when it finally came down to it. There were basically 70% of the House of Representatives voted to, do a sane thing with, actually approving a debt ceiling raise. Now, granted, there were some dumb conditions, and that some of that's going to have to be fixed and unwound and what have you. But there were 30% of the House of Representatives that, for whatever reason, were willing to sort of, sit back and watch the entire world burn. And I think most people are freaking sick of that. I think they really want, a stable, normal kind of existence. So, I think that when we talk about, who's vulnerable to Trump's messaging, a lot of times it's people that feel like that their power is being threatened. I want to say that I don't think it's a matter of education so much, because I spend a lot of time going to events where these people are present, and I listen to how they talk and what they say to each other and how they behave around each other. And for the most part, they're like normal people. They are kind and considerate to each other and watching out for each other and being congenial, and they hold real jobs where they have to do things like do math, and they're not total idiots. And
I'm talking more about that kind of radar where you can sense whether something is propaganda or not.
Well, there's that.
Few people are blessed with that.
Well, I think that's true, but also there's a lot of people that want to belong to an in-group or already do belong to some in-group, and that in-group feels a certain way about the situation. And so they become very self-reinforcing in their information environment. And this is what I mean when I listen to the right-wing callers calling in on C-SPAN. They all have the same messaging. And it's like, where do you get that messaging if not from, the Fox Newses and the Daily Callers and the Gateway Pundits and, all of that. And there's an ability where, being part of the in-group seems to override any kind of critical thinking, and again, they're not stupid, but the in-group thing overrides their ability to detect, that maybe this isn't true. You can't say these things because they're not true. The being part of the in-group is more valuable to them. So it's fascinating, again, to kind of observe that, but I think it is kind of complicated. And I do think most people, it's, because we have this first past the post, two-party electoral system, everybody's kind of tempted to say that the country is bifurcated 50-50, but it's not. There were 80 million votes on each side. That's only 160 million people. There's a whole nother 100 million people that are just checked out, It's complicated, I guess, as how I would put it.
So let's talk percentages for a second, because I think this is something that is very hard for people to grasp, because the MAGA Republicans make so much noise. They shout the loudest, and invariably the noise kind of gives the impression that there are more of them than there are. So let's just kind of let's try to allay people's fears, because you mentioned 35% earlier. I mean, there's obviously Trump's base, those who buy the T-shirts and the hats, right? So we know about that lot. But it's the others that I'm really interested in, who are lifelong conservatives and are basically stuck with Trump because he's polling at 47% of the for the primary. I mean, what kind of numbers are we talking about here on a national basis?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting report on this from an outfit called hiddentribes.us. You can go look that up. And what it shows, and this was a study done in 2018, so it's a little out of date now, but I don't think that structurally things are that much different. It shows that there's maybe around 25 to 30% of folks that are on like the far right that are you would consider them to be sort of like hardcore conservatives. But of those, it's only like 19%, of the total 100% spectrum that are like super, hardcore conservative. And that's really where that MAGA base resides. Then, again, there's this big swath of people that are kind of in the middle, liberals and, left-leaning conservatives and that kind of thing. And then there's, a faction on the far left as well. I tend to think that the real hardcore MAGA crowd, you might be looking at something like 300 million times, let's call it 24%, so you might be looking at 60 million, 70 million people, which is a lot, which is way too many in a lot of ways, but it's not 50% of the country, and that's kind of how it's been portrayed. And there's a lot of folks that, have voted, Republican because they don't really want to vote Democrat, but they're not necessarily down with that MAGA faction either. And we're starting to see more, bifurcation there. There's also, I think, a, definite bifurcation in the right itself, where there's a lot of people that are sort of in the political right that are, more in the middle, that are trying to gain power back from the MAGA right. But the problem with the extremism is that extremism is really good for winning primaries, because, you're going to get people to turn out because they're very reactive. There's a good study by a political scientist named Dr. Liliana Mason, who I've interviewed before. And, basically what it shows is that sort of the more drawn into these political in-groups that you are, and the more your social circle is tied into it, the more you feel threatened by the out-group. And so you're definitely going to vote in the primary because you have to destroy the opponent, right? So that's why we have this kind of issue in this country, is that, primary elections end up selecting for extremist candidates. And then general elections, people are like, oh, I have no choices because, well, guess what? The extremists got put into the primaries, so it's a really pernicious kind of problem. And, you've seen examples where, if candidates don't agree to kind of go with the most extremist positions, that the threat is that they're going to get primaried. And that's happened again and again, in both the right and the left. So it's a structural problem, and I think some, pretty nefarious folks, realizing that structural problem exists, have done what they can to take advantage of it.
And Trump's taking advantage of it because
Sure.
he loves the fact that he's out front. I mean, it gives him huge credence, and it also, he's using his polling to weaponize the fact that the investigation against him is a sham, because he's out front, and therefore they're only doing it to prevent him from winning. And that rhetoric it's so dangerous because it also adds up, right? It also makes perfect sense to anybody who's not prepared to look into the detail. or maybe lacks, as you describe, critical thinking, which I guess is what I was getting at earlier, that ability to think critically, and outside of your domain. It makes sense that Biden would want to have him arrested and put him behind bars.
Well, I mean, there's certainly reasons why you could, paint that picture, and, why you would say, Biden might want to slow down a political opponent. But, again, the facts of the matter are that, the Department of Justice pursued this independently. I don't think Joe Biden was calling up Merrick Garland and saying, you got to prosecute this guy. And of course, that's the story that's being told. But again, like you say, it's the resonance, the emotional resonance, the kind of narrative resonance within the in-group is so strong that, people feel like, yeah, this feels like, our side is being unfairly picked on. And why is that? And again, I hear that in these C-SPAN comments every day. People are, anytime Trump does anything wrong, they come back with, these whataboutist arguments. And that's a formal logical fallacy. It's called a tu quoque fallacy, which basically means you as well. And so it's a way of deflecting from the crime at hand and saying, oh, well, they do it too, and so therefore it's just as bad. Well, is it great that Joe Biden had documents in his garage next to the Corvette? No, it's not great. But at the same time, he gave them back. He didn't hide it. He didn't lie about it. And, there's an effort to sort of, I call it the extraction of the pound of flesh on any given issue. Like if the left does something or the right does something, the pound of flesh has to be extracted from the left as well, and so it's just, a really low form of debate and of argument and of critical thinking. And, but it feels really good to these in-group, out-group tensions.
And the right and the drama and the extremism is always kind of more energizing and more and in terms of populism, it seems to garner more attention. And Joe Biden could be doing more, in my opinion, and the Democrats could be doing more to create the counter-argument rather than just letting the Republicans hang themselves. And I want to give an example, which is this investigation, or this sham of an investigation, as it's been called, that's been going on, that the Chairman James Comer and the Oversight Committee, Republicans, investigating the Biden family's domestic and international business dealings to determine whether these activities compromise U.S. national security and Biden's ability to lead independently. But the problem is they have no evidence, and they're basically in a bit of a checkmate situation, aren't they? Because they're making a whole lot of noise about something that has no substance. I mean, will this backfire, or is it actually kind of helpful to Trump?
Well, I think if there's some sort of actual wrongdoing there, then, that's not great and it should be exposed. But as you say, so far, there's not any suggestion that anything, I listen to these callers and they call in and they talk about the LLCs and the Burisma and the tapes and all this. And I'm like, okay, well, that sounds not great, but like, what exactly is he accused of doing? Is he profiting from something illegally? If so, what?
But does America need evidence anymore? I mean, this is my concern, is that this total lack of evidence seems to be irrelevant. And the fact that on the opposite side, the Justice Department's investigation has a treasure trove of evidence.
They have indictments that lay out that evidence as well.
Yeah, I mean, the indictment is insane. I mean, to read it, it's mind-blowing. But again, it just doesn't seem to matter with Republicans, because they almost know that the people who are buying the stuff that they're peddling don't really care. It's I think they don't investigation really care. In search of a crime.
It's all a question of keeping the ball in the air long enough for it to be in play, and to have something allegedly that's going to be revealed. It's all, and it's like a lot of these things. It's all about the reveal that's just around the corner.
Right.
It's like the UFO,
like Trump's healthcare plan,
or the Fed, or the healthcare plan, or infrastructure week. It's like it always going to be just around the corner. And I mean, I'm as open as anybody to seeing evidence that, the Bidens did anything wrong, but it sounds just like normal kind of, complex business dealings that people often have. And, Should they be involved in like, Ukrainian oil and gas type stuff? Arguably, maybe that's not the best move. But is it illegal or is it wrong? I don't think there's enough evidence presented to say one way or the other. And it's just seems like, a little bit of a witch hunt to try to find something that meets some kind of standard of proof. But I just don't see it.
But isn't that difference maybe what Democrats should be highlighting? The difference between one side being like drowning in corruption and the other side actually being pretty clean.
Yeah, I think
why not make more of that?
Well, I think they also don't want to call attention to stuff that's insane, and to some extent, by giving it oxygen, like suppose Biden went on the defensive and say, I did nothing wrong. I deny any allegations that might be coming from these materials. This is all bunk. Then that gives them fuel that they can play back on their own programs and get people riled up with that. As where the approach that he seems to be taking, and I was skeptical that this was totally the right approach too, but I'm starting to become a little bit more of a fan, is to play to this 70% in the center and basically just say, look, most of you are normal and just want to like do stuff and not, live in a fantasy crazy land. And I'm going to talk to you. And because you are the majority, you're a heavy majority. And I think that to some extent works. And I saw some kind of thing going around. I don't know whether it was a story or just some tweets or something, but like apparently there's a distinct strategy within the administration to basically just sideline the MAGA stuff by marginalizing it and just basically calling it out as aberrant, by downplaying it, and basically suggesting that, it's on the way out, it's fading. Now, is that true? I don't know. I think that the jury's a little bit out on that. But in terms of a strategy to kind of take power away from it, I think it might actually be pretty good. And if you couple that with a couple of other targeted, sort of things to deal them defeats in very specific ways, I think it might actually work. Because again, I mean, what has Trump won lately? He won the election in 2016 with a lot of help from, Russia and other folks. He lost the 2018 midterms. He lost the 2020 election. He lost the 2022 midterms. Didn't deliver results for anybody. So, I think maybe it is a mistake to treat him as being more powerful than he actually might be, especially, I don't know how this indictment's going to play out. And obviously the fact that it's sitting with Eileen Cannon is not great. And I hope that like the fix isn't in or something like that. But, he may not be available to run really in 2024. He may have too many other complications. And of course he could, drop dead at any given time too. Just he's an old guy as well. So
I was actually thinking about that earlier. I don't know why, whether it was a kind of fantasy of mine or something, but I was thinking how interesting it would be if there was a sudden kind of health thing, because it seems that, considering his diet and his obesity and all of the things that go with it, he's definitely on the list for dying, but it just doesn't seem to happen. And it seems to me that he's just an anomaly in humanity, that not just does he not die from his diet and his lifestyle, but that he also seems to be immune to prosecution. Like, no matter what you throw at this guy, very little sticks.
Yeah, no, and we'll have to see how this, latest indictment goes down. Of course, there's the possibility of additional indictments coming from Jack Smith and special counsel's office, with respect to, there's another grand jury impaneled in D.C. There's the January 6th investigation. So I think, he may get a few more things tossed at his way as well. But, the fact that there is just this kind of like double standard of justice. I mean, I was looking at some of the conditions on his release with the indictment, and, he doesn't have any restrictions on his travel internationally or domestic, no restrictions on what he can say, who he can talk to. I mean, you have to think he's like going in full blown witness tampering mode, so like, I don't know, it seems bad, but, hopefully it's not as bad as it seems.
But that's just doubling down on the white privilege and, how white-collar crime tends not to be dealt with in the same way that other crimes are. And really this just supports the argument that there is a two-tier justice system And I mean, Trump himself, I'll just quote something that he said. He said there was an unwritten rule not to prosecute former presidents and political rivals. This was a speech he made at his golf club in New Jersey. He said, I will appoint a real special prosecutor to go after the most corrupt president in the history of America, Joe Biden, and go after the Biden crime family. It's as if, reversing everything. I mean, people say if you just reverse whatever Trump says, then you'll get the truth.
Yeah.
This projection and creating this Biden crime family. I mean, look, Hunter Biden should never have worked for Burisma. I think the quote from Joe is, I hope you know what you're doing, right? But that was probably a really bad idea. But Hunter Biden never worked in the administration. He never had anything to do with, never even barely seen in the White House. Whereas Trump just ran America like a family business.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, he's basically, as you said, kind of projecting and using this kind of inversion tactic. They call it the DARVO, tactic that is used by narcissists and stuff to deflect in reverse, onto the onto the victim. And it's a really powerful rhetorical technique, and I think it's really well suited to social media and this kind of choose your own adventure reality that we have going on right now, where people can just live in whatever epistemological universe they choose to of their own making. It's entirely scary.
And I think social media supports that, doesn't it? If we existed in a time before social media, which isn't going back that far, I don't think that information would snowball at the rate that it does and create, two very clear lanes of information.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you look back to the 1960s when, there were a couple of major, news broadcasters who basically established reality every night,
Yeah.
And people lived in those worlds, and Time Magazine and Life. I mean, and that was part of the reason why those channels were so valuable for, sort of shaping and public sentiment building, with intelligence agencies and stuff like that too. But like now it's a much more, sort of complex information environment, but people can be living entirely in their own little worlds. And, people like Elon Musk are basically able to shape reality to some extent to their choosing. And it's a very bizarre landscape to be living in.
I want to talk about Musk and his relationship with RFK, who's another Democratic candidate, oddly, in just a moment. We'll take a quick pause for our sponsor here on The Weekend Show. Cold turkey may be great on sandwiches, but there's a better way to break your bad habits. We're not talking about some weird mind voodoo from your wacky neighbor or some sketchy message board. We're talking about our sponsor, Fume, and they look at the problem in a different way. Not everything in a bad habit is wrong, so instead of a drastic, uncomfortable change, why not just remove the bad from your habit? Fume is an innovative, award-nominated device that does just that. Instead of electronics, Fume is completely natural. Instead of vapor, Fume uses flavored air. And instead of harmful chemicals, Fume uses all natural, delicious flavors. You get it. Instead of bad, Fume is good. It's a habit you're free to enjoy and makes replacing your bad habit easy. Your Fume comes with an adjustable airflow dial that is designed with movable parts and magnets for fidgeting, giving your fingers a lot to do, which is helpful for de-stressing and anxiety while breaking your habit. I gave a Fume to my sister, and she was shocked at how flavorful and fresh it tasted. It's easy to hold and perfectly balanced, and quite honestly, extremely fun to fidget with. The real wood material and sleek design definitely classes it up, and she feels pretty cool holding it. Stopping is something we all put off because it's hard, but switching to Fume is easy, enjoyable, and even fun. Fume has served over 100,000 customers and has thousands of success stories, and there's no reason that can't be you. Join Fume in accelerating humanity's breakup from destructive habits by picking up the Journey Pack today. Head to tryfume.com and use code WEEKEND to save 10% off when you get the Journey Pack today. That's tryfum.com and use code WEEKEND to save an additional 10% off your order today. Did you know that your temperature at night can have one of the greatest impacts on your sleep quality? If you wake up too hot or too cold, I highly recommend you check out Miracle Made's bed sheets. Inspired by NASA, Miracle Made uses silver-infused fabrics and makes temperature-regulating bedding, so you can sleep at the perfect temperature all night long. Using silver-infused fabrics originally inspired by NASA, Miracle Made sheets are thermoregulating and designed to keep you at the perfect temperature all night long, so you get a better sleep every night. These sheets are infused with silver that prevent up to 99.7% of bacterial growth, leaving them to stay cleaner and fresh 3 times longer than other sheets. No more gross odors. Miracle sheets are luxuriously comfortable, without the high price tag of other luxury brands, and feel as nice, if not nicer, than bed sheets used by some 5-star hotels. Stop sleeping on bacteria. Bacteria can clog your pores, causing breakouts and acne. Sleep clean with Miracle. Go to trymiracle.com/weekend to try Miracle Made sheets today. And whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo code WEEKEND at checkout, you'll get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. Miracle is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you aren't 100% satisfied, you'll get a full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/weekend and use the code WEEKEND to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40% off. That's trymiracle.com/weekend to treat yourself. Thank you, Miracle Made, for sponsoring this episode. We're back with Dave Troy here on The Weekend Show. I'm Anthony Davis, and we've been looking at the reaction of Donald Trump to not just his indictment, but also the language that he uses and how the language has a lasting effect on democracy. Just before we stopped, I want to talk about Elon Musk and his control of information, because he really now has nailed his colours to the mast, hasn't he? Claiming that hate speech is free speech, and that in itself is very, very dangerous. And I'm from the UK, where hate speech is a crime,
right.
And it still feels like a free country, and we still feel like we have freedom of speech. But if you say hateful things about a religious group or a social group or an individual, obviously, and they make a complaint, then you'll get a knock on the door, and it'll be investigated, and you can be punished. And so. When I tell American friends about this, they just think that's so crazy. And they're like, how can you think of yourself as free? But, you have to have a construct of what is acceptable just socially, especially online. So what's Elon Musk's long game regarding the election, do you think?
Well, I mean, we could do hours worth of shows, talking about this. And indeed, I occupy a lot of my time on my podcast really talking about this set of issues, and folks are invited to check that out. But, I think it's really easy to weaponize this idea of free speech in the United States. And, the First Amendment to the Constitution was written, with this pretty, sharp point of view in mind, which is that, no, the government will not make any laws regarding the restriction of speech. And, there's obviously been various case law and examples, special exceptions that have come up with respect to things you can and can't do in that regard. However, for the most part, free speech is pretty absolute in the United States. And what, I think Musk is really trying to make possible is the weaponization of language and speech, and really of reality. And if you think about all the different ways that he himself tends to use speech, he uses memetics extensively, and jokes and humor and financial manipulation and all kinds of speech that has effects on the real world. And so I think the issue that the framers had is that they never really, I don't think, maybe I'm wrong, and if somebody listening knows contrary, I'd love to hear. But I don't think that the framers had in mind that people would be saying things that they didn't necessarily believe. I think that they had it built into the idea of free speech that it was good faith free speech, that I actually believe the thing that I'm saying. And what we're starting to see now is the decoupling of belief from speech and the weaponization of information on populations. So if, for example, I didn't necessarily believe that, some, I don't know, racial slur thing about Jews or whatever was true, but I knew that if I said this really horrible thing, that I could rile up a section of the population in ways that would produce effects that benefited my program, whatever my program might be, which might be to make the country more unruly or make it more, fractious or divided or what have you, then I might say those things, even though I don't believe them. And then the next day, I might say something that seems to totally contradict that. But it has.
You've got to be a certain type of shit to want to be able to do that. I mean, it's knowing that you are A, the richest person in the world, but B, you control the information stream.
Yeah.
To want to purposely cause confusion and chaos.
Yep.
Makes you, I mean, this is a certain kind of evil that we might not have really seen before.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see it to some extent in people, like Hitler and the Third Reich and that sort of thing. But the fact that, Musk is really kind of like taking it to being a practice, that it's not only something that he's doing, but he's sort of teaching others how to do it as well, and in creating a space for them to do it. And creating a network of people that do it, and they're all internetworking with each other. I mean, it really is a really dangerous environment in many ways. And I think that it gets conflated with this free speech issue, which is very confusing for the public because, like, who doesn't want to believe in free speech? Free speech is good, like you said. However, nobody's really thought about what would happen if you ended up with a world where people were purposely weaponizing information payloads at specifically targeted audiences seeking to produce certain kinds of behavior. And I use that chain of thought, information payloads directed at specific audiences to produce a specific kind of behavior, because that's the foundation of psychological warfare. That is how psychological warfare works. And you use information in a way that's instrumental. It doesn't have any value as truth. It's a question of what effects does it produce. And so I learned this lesson when I was, studying Cambridge Analytica. And one of the examples that, came up back in that case was that company, which, had been called SCL Elections, used as an example the idea, if you put up a sign at the beach that says, like, no swimming, private property, well, nobody's going to pay any attention to that. But, if you say no swimming, sharks sighted, then people are like, oh, shit, I'm not going to go swim in that, sharks, now are there actually sharks? No, but it has the effect that you want to have on the target population. And there
are potentially sharks. That's the other thing. It's like there's no way to prove that because it's open water that a shark could come in.
Yeah, you don't know. People are saying there might be sharks, So it's that kind of approach to information and language and truth. And, it has the effect of eroding people's ability to, construct a reality that makes any sense, So like, as Elon does crazy thing A on one day and then crazy thing B on the next day, and people go, oh, what does he mean? And then they try to reconcile it. You end up creating these groups that are like all in tension with each other. They don't know which way is up. You end up having these kinds of long-term epistemological erosion effects on the population. We don't know how to know what we know at some point, So it's a very dangerous approach, and he's very good at it, and he's teaching a lot of other people to do the same.
This idea of bending reality, I mean, it used to be only something that you would see in movies, and now it's a thing. Because we rely on information, and we rely on news organizations or social media, because a lot of people don't go out much, they don't need to now. They don't go to the movie theater because they've got a big TV at home.
Mm-hmm.
They don't need to interact with people, especially strangers. So they tend to kind of be interacting in chat rooms or on message boards or in a kind of social environment that is entirely kind of virtual. And yet, knowing which way is up and which way is down is becoming increasingly difficult. To live in that space where you really only communicate with people in a virtual environment relies on everybody telling the truth, or at least sticking to their
trying
viewpoint,
to
right?
you to some kind of shared reality, at least you hope, And I think
but this is what I'm most interested in: is Elon consciously whipping the floor out from under people's feet, knowing that it's like
so.
with a maniacal laugh afterwards, because that's who he, I guess, seeks to be.
Well, so, my theory of kind of how he thinks about the world is that, I think he sincerely wants to do this multiplanetary species agenda thing. And, you can get into whether that needs to be done or is a good idea or whatever, but he really wants to do that. And the way that he has constructed his view of the world right now is that he sees governments, woke mind virus, he sees the Federal Reserve, he sees banks, he sees corporations as getting in the way of that goal. And not only getting in the way of that goal, but getting in the way of the evolution and growth of humanity as a species. In addition to that, he sees basically being impeded in the growth of transhumanist intelligence, the idea that we can augment our, intelligence as humans and become more intelligent, as well as the growth of artificial intelligence and ultimately artificial superintelligence. And so if you see yourself, as many narcissists would, as the central linchpin of humanity achieving its full potential and basically everybody else as getting in the way, then you're going to start to organize your world in a way where, you start to attack institutions, governments, populations that are seeming to be obstacles. And, that's psychopathic, sociopathic kind of behavior, but that seems to be the plan. And I think anybody that kind of thinks it's something other than that or thinks it's something less than that is just deluding themselves. At the end of the day, he's not just trying to make cars, he's got a much, much bigger agenda on his mind. And, to his credit, he is a big thinker, but, he's also thinking in similar ways that Hitler did. And it's really not cool,
And so all of this effort, because I know the UK announced the other day that they're going to set up some kind of alliance that enables them to focus on controlling AI.
Yeah.
They didn't set any date for it. I think it was just electioneering from Rishi Sunak.
Yeah.
And Biden didn't really show a huge interest in it. But the point is that they're trying to control AI, but actually they should be controlling Elon Musk because, AI comes later in a way. You've actually got far more dangerous things to regulate, such as the richest guy in the world with access to unlimited resources, who doesn't like the institutions that maintain a society, a civil society. Because money talks, because wealth, especially in America, people are like, oh, well, they're rich, they must know what they're doing. Trump obviously used that card to get elected, and look where that ended up.
Yeah.
This is very dangerous, isn't it? Because I don't see anybody. Musk is having seminars with Biden and other heads of state and trying to position himself at the very center of government as an advisor. And yet you're saying he has an agenda all of his own. This is something out of a Marvel movie.
Yeah, no, and it's incredibly dangerous, and a lot of the stuff that people are talking about with respect to AI is really pretty fantastical. The idea that AI is going to lead to the extinction of humanity and all of this stuff, and it's something like the near term. I don't think that those arguments are valid. It's a very small circle of people ultimately that's putting out these doomer arguments. And anytime somebody's coming out with a doomer argument that says, if we don't do X right now, the thing that I say, the world is going to come to an end. I think people's radar should be up that, perhaps this is not a good faith argument, or perhaps these people are delusional. It's like, you're trying to seduce somebody, oh, you have to sleep with me tonight or the world's going to come to an end. It's like, no, maybe let's stop and pause here for a second. So I think, some of this stuff with AI is being used to kind of create an emergency that allows people that have a lot of power to get more power ultimately. And while sure, they're calling for like regulation and stuff like that, it's basically like, hey, why don't you get a bunch of my friends together who are really smart, because you need people that are really smart about AI and who come from the same background that I do, in order to regulate the AI, and then they'll regulate the AI. And of course, I'll end up on top of that because, I'm part of that circle, in the meantime, there's all of these harms that are happening to creators, to, marginalized people, to people that are having to train these models, often for very low pay. And those harms aren't really being actively addressed right now. We're worried about, somehow or another, it's going to blow up the world, Sure. Are there risks to these technologies? Yes, but I would argue that they're mostly happening right now. And we should pay attention to the people that are being harmed today, not hypothetical, maybe future people that are going to be harmed in 2 years. And I personally, my belief is that we're going to look back on this in a couple of years and kind of go, this seems to have slowed down a little bit. Not to say that, AI development and things aren't going to continue to fold out in all sorts of places in our society, because they will. But I think that the notion that there's like some imminent, right now there's a huge existential threat, I just don't think the evidence is going to bear that out.
I rewatched Don't Look Up on Netflix the other day. And, Musk and the Mark Rylance character are intertwined in so many ways. And I do recommend people watching it. And just as an aside, I was tweeting about Elon Musk the other day. I tried to limit my Elon Musk tweets because I don't want to be thrown off Twitter. I don't know if you do the same. And a former colleague of mine said, do you remember when you emceed that party for Elon Musk 20 years ago? I was like, I literally have no memory of that. I think he owned PayPal at the time, and I think we did an event for PayPal. It's so funny, that kind of completely left my memory bank. I want to talk about RFK for a second, because there's not many Democrat candidates out there for the primary. Marianne Williamson, RFK are in the running. But I want to talk about Elon Musk's relationship with him, because he seems to be like already starting to nudge some support in his direction and give a platform to somebody who, to all intents and purposes, as a vaccine skeptic and misinformation person, is very dangerous.
Yeah, definitely. So, with respect to RFK, I've been doing a lot of research on the network that is pushing this. And he and Marianne Williamson actually are coming from pretty much the same network of people. There is this new age kind of network that really goes back to the 1970s, and you can find traces of it before that. But the place where I really see it merge is with these. There was an organization called the National Health Federation. And basically, this was the outfit that was sort of a wing of the John Birch Society that was pushing anti-vax content, Laetrile, which was a fake cancer drug, and anti-fluoridation. They were concerned about public water fluoridation. So that group kind of merged in some of their conferences with the New Age community in about 1979. And so there was an event that formed out of that called the Whole Life Expo. And that event ran for a long time, and I have a whole history of this that I'm working on. But basically, this is where this kind of left and right merger sort of took place within this kind of New Age vector. And so all of the anti-vax stuff, a lot of the New Age stuff comes out of that vector. And so Marianne Williamson, is like part of that same network. She spoke at, multiple ones of these it was called the Whole Life Expo. It changed to being called the Conscious Life Expo. There's another one called New Living Expo, which is really the same people. So this New Age network of left and right people, they're like super into like UFOs. They're super into crypto. They're super against the Federal Reserve. And so like Mickey Willis is part of this network. Del Bigtree, big anti-vaxxer. G. Edward Griffin of the John Birch Society is part of this network. Basically that's where, the both of them came from. And yeah, sure, they're sort of both nominally competing, but what they're both really doing in effect is creating, sort of alternate talking points within the Democratic sphere to create some kind of oppositional arguments against, Biden. And so, like we talked about with Trump, where he kind of throws stuff against the wall and sees what sticks, they're kind of doing that process as well right now. And, you've got people like Musk and David Sachs who have been promoting RFK Jr. very heavily, as well as Jack Dorsey has come out. He actually formally endorsed RFK Jr. But
couldn't really say why. I mean, that was kind of interesting. Yeah. Just didn't really have anything to say.
And the reason is because of Bitcoin. Jack is super convinced that Bitcoin is going to lead to peace on Earth. Again, not really. Well, if you really want to know the argument for why he thinks that, it's because the argument that goes back to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is that all wars are caused by bankers, and if you basically eliminate bankers, then you won't have any wars. And that's a super anti-Semitic formulation, but that's basically what Jack is invoking there. Yeah, it's that's basically why that network is into this, is because of Bitcoin and financial, monetary policy. They want to introduce, Bitcoin and other hard currencies, derivative of gold and silver and stuff like that, and get rid of the Federal Reserve and fiat currency. That's why this whole thing is really about the dollar at the end of the day. So that's what's going on.
As most things are.
Yeah, well, and it's about monetary policy, and so this is rehashing this grape that goes back to 1933 when Roosevelt, outlawed gold and took the country off the gold standard.
Again, this goes back to destabilizing reality, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because we rely on a currency and a sovereign nation to have its currency to enable the transaction of goods and services and everything. And so the moment, again, it's the rug being ripped out from underneath the people, and the people are the ones who suffer. I mean, I remember this from when Europe took the euro and lost its local currencies. And I remember I had a friend in Paris who lost half the value of his home when they switched from the French franc to the euro. Literally half the value just disappeared overnight. And it took them decades to kind of to gain that back.
Right.
I think people really underestimate quite how these institutional pillars bring a balance to a civilized society. And yet the people like Dorsey and Musk, and even RFK to a certain extent with his anti-vax rhetoric, the danger of giving these people airtime is not just in the moment, but it is everlasting, in the same way that Trumpism will continue for decades after Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because as we've said, 70% of people, roughly speaking, think all of this stuff is crazy nonsense. People don't want to switch off of banks and start using Bitcoin. And the idea
didn't it used to be bigger? It used to be 95% of people. I mean, that's my concern, is that we talked about these people as the fringe and as minority. Yes. And now that part has extended to the fact that Trumpism is mainstream. It's not a faction.
Well, it's still like a 30% faction in many ways, but I get what you mean. It is sort of talked about all the time, and it definitely is that. And so I think the question, though, you really have to ask is, okay, well, yeah, sure, you say you're down with Trumpism, but do you really want to blow up the Federal Reserve? Like, is that, you really want to do that? Because if you want to do that, we can do that, but you're going to lose like 50% of the value of your 401k. It might totally destabilize your finances. You might lose your house. There's a whole bunch of things that could happen. And while on the one hand, I think that these extremist ideologues like Musk and Mercer and people like that, yeah, they don't care, because their firm conviction is that fiat dollars aren't real, and that only by having hard currency, whether that's Bitcoin or gold or silver, is anything real anyway. So the longer that they persist in this unreality of fiat currency, the more harm is done to them, they think. So they're more than willing to go through these apocalyptic passages in order to bring this about. But when you take it to a vote in like Congress, most people are like, what? You really want to drive this thing over the cliff? Like, that's what that whole debt, vote was really ultimately about, was whether or not we wanted to plunge the country into default, to damage the dollar. Dude, there's a whole thing about this. There's this thing called the North Paul strategy that was outlined by Gary North and Ron Paul, where basically they felt like at some point the fiat dollar would reach a crisis point such that it would collapse. And at that time, a hard currency could be introduced. And it would be the equivalent of the apotheosis that somebody, goes through when they repent, and they basically are like, unless the country repents against its sins, for having done the fiat dollar, then we can never fully recover. And so there's this bizarre kind of like quasi-religious, quasi-economics argument that they put out there. And that's what like Dorsey and Musk actually believe. If you recall, back in October of 2022, or maybe it was 2021, I forget right now. But anyway, several months ago, Dorsey put out a tweet that said, hyperinflation is here, it's happening. And like, dude, no, this is not hyperinflation. Like, bread costs a little more, but like, this isn't like where, currency is losing half of its value every 10 days or something. That's hyperinflation, And so his belief that there's this apocalyptic moment right around the corner with respect to money is what's informing his endorsement of JFK or RFK. And it's crazy. It's just flat out crazy. And so then the question you might ask is, how did Jack Dorsey get to be crazy? Well, I've known the guy for 15 years, and I think he's a nice, decent person in many ways, quite smart. But he also, has a kind of a sheltered view of the world. He kind of got successful young. He doesn't necessarily have a ton of like education, to, not put too fine a point on it. But even more importantly, he's a target of influence, just like RFK Jr. would have been. And you think about all the people that tried to, would have tried to like, use RFK Jr. for clout, to try to get him to do stuff, to try to control his mind over the course of the decades. And, that guy's brain is very clearly been turned to soup,
Yeah.
And
well, if you hear him speak, you're just like,
well, he has some kind of disorder, like spasmodic.
No, I don't mean vocally, but
none of the things he say make any sense.
It makes no sense. Yeah, he has like a spasmic.
It's called spasmodic dysphonia.
Right. I'm pleased you said that, and not me.
I just fun fact I happen to know.
He went on Joe Rogan's podcast, and I mean, here's the other irony: is that Joe Rogan has the most popular podcast in America, and he's another one who is easily
he's part of the
influenced.
same network,
same group, and again, a total crackpot, talks very convincingly because he's got that man of the people attitude.
Yeah,
and people are like, we're finding stuff out, and it's all agenda based. And like pretending to not really understand, so asking probing questions, it's all an act. But RFK Jr. went on there and he said he believed his uncle was assassinated by the CIA, and he said that he is aware that he too could be targeted by US intelligence, and all this crazy stuff. I mean, is this helpful in the bigger picture? Because I'm a kind of big picture guy, right? And I like to, as you described, the 70% of people who are critical thinkers, who are hanging on to reality, albeit by a thread. I mean, to have RFK Jr. as a Democratic candidate who is doing the rounds and talking in this in this way, as he has done for years, but it's ramping up as it ever does. I mean, again, the effect on people's engagement with the vote, is it going to affect things in 2024?
Well, I sometimes will tweet about, things that RFK Jr. is doing, and sometimes people will respond like, oh, it doesn't matter because he can't possibly win. He's crazy. And I'm like, dude, it's not that he's going to win. That's the problem. Although, we should be careful that he doesn't win, because you never know. But it's more the damage that it does to the information environment and to the public, because unfortunately he's polling like in the double digits amongst Democrats. Like, I don't know why exactly. I have some guesses. I mean, the Kennedy name is very powerful. There's a lot of people who feel disaffected. That, a lot of the same phenomena that are on the right are present on the left as well. There's a significant quote unquote anti-war faction among the left that, resonates with what he's saying about Ukraine, which is really a straight up pro-Putin message.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
and Joe Biden's age and aspects of his candidacy, which are, bothersome to everybody. Everybody would rather Joe Biden was 20 years younger.
He was 55, but he's not, and so I think that, it's fairly easy to find a faction of the Democratic left that, is willing to listen to other candidates. And, unfortunately, to the extent that Biden really addresses that 70% in the middle, those people aren't them. That's definitely a 8 to 10% faction on the far left that he's not going to be able to readily attract. So then the question becomes, well, how does a Democratic primary play out? And of course, the ordering has all been changed with that, with South Carolina and whatnot now. So I don't think that he has any real danger of not being the nominee. On the other hand, the strategy I think people really need to understand about what Musk is doing is that recall that, his support for RFK Jr. is roughly as strong as his support for DeSantis. And they're both saying really similar things if you actually look at kind of like what the overall messaging is. So, the concern that I have is that, there's an effort to build up what I call a red-brown alliance, which has historically been called a red-brown alliance, where really you take kind of the far left and mix it with the far right and use that as a cudgel to beat up the center, the middle 70%. And that's a very well-documented strategy throughout time. It was used by the fascists. It's been written about in detail by Alexander Dugin. It's been written about by Willis Carto, who was David Duke's mentor. It's a serious strategy. It can work. So I think, we need to be very on the lookout for how that left-brown alliance, or red-brown alliance, left-right alliance comes together and how it's deployed. Because, if you read Dugin's stuff about his political philosophy, this was, I was reading a book about this from 30 years ago about this, that said that it was past the right, past the left, but against the center always. And, that's what we've got going on here, is an attempt to take these far left, far right factions and use it to harm the center as much as possible.
I was daydreaming about a Democratic supermajority, and the idea that if that happened, you could deal with all of these issues, polarizing issues, pretty quickly, give women back the right to choose, and ban assault weapons, and all of the obvious stuff, not to mention stuff that's backing that up. If there was if all of this Trump rhetoric turned out to just be propaganda and a whole lot of noise, and actually people of all colors and stripes realized that actually a vote for Democrat is also a vote for democracy, maintaining the structure, that a supermajority could put America back on track and bring it back from it. It's been unwound 50 years with Roe and Dobbs. I mean, what are the chances of that surprising us all?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think we should be hopeful that some moment like that could happen. I know several political analysts. I mentioned Liliana Mason, and she wrote exactly that argument in her book, that in effect, democracy is on the ballot, and if you want democracy and equality and freedoms, vote for people that are, willing to build up these institutions and to secure those rights. You can do that. I think, from speaking more pragmatically, there's just so much noise and craziness going on in the ecosystem that it's difficult to even sort out how we would get to that point. Like you've got people like Kristen Sinema, who now is an independent, and people like Joe Manchin, who, end up serving as spoilers in the Senate. You've got, the Justice Democrats in the House who are all over the place. They sometimes vote with the president, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have reasons for that. Sometimes they're just being obstructionist. Sometimes maybe they're under influence. I don't know why they do some of the things that they do. Why is someone like Jamie Raskin associating himself with some of the people more extreme in that faction? I don't know. It doesn't make sense. But I think to the extent that, we could have more people that are just basically trying to do the stuff that the 70% agrees is a good idea, which is, again, really centered around stability and decency and creating conditions that are favorable for Americans. A lot could be done. I don't know whether practically we're going to get there. I think the country is becoming more accustomed to understanding what information warfare looks like, what bad faith engagement looks like. And I think they're getting more skeptical, which is, I guess, more a good thing as much as it is a bad thing. I mean, people are becoming almost too cynical that like nothing is real and everything's a psyop and whatever else. And, the truth is only some things are psyops, and the trick is knowing which ones, and that's really hard. But, I think we may get to a point where people are able to kind of see past the craziness and like actually be able to detect people that are acting authentically and in good faith. And if we can kind of build up that muscle, then maybe there's hope.
Okay. We have to finish, but Dave Troy, thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to join me for my new show on Wednesdays. It's called MAGA Uncovered with Ron Filipkowski. You can support me and independent journalism on Patreon at patreon.com/5Minute News. Join me next week with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.